decisions, can block legislation once it's actually been approved by a bipolar parliament, House of Representatives and presented by a bipolar Council of Ministers. So there's a lot of levels at which the French can block things. There's nothing of the sort in the Senate. Now, for all sorts of reasons, the Senate, Canadian Senate, has been embroiled in a drama, psychodrama recently with corruption and so on. So there's a strong sense in the part of the country, particularly in the West, that the Senate is a costly, hopeless affair and should simply be abolished. And the idea that the Senate could be reformed to be a more federal institution is no longer really sold, and you can correct me on this, I would say for two reasons. One is this profound belief that constitutional reform is impossible. You wouldn't get the consensus to do it. And secondly, there would be, the reason you wouldn't get a consensus, very, very different visions about what the federal Senate would have to be. So from the West, mostly, you would have a vision that the Senate should be similar to the American Senate with equal representation of all the provinces. And from, of course, Quebec and other parts of the country, you have the sense that the Senate should also at least represent the distinct groups, the minorities, and so on. There'd be a very strong opposition. Right now, in the current reform in Belgium, there is, and right now the Senate is voting itself on its own reform as we speak, to reform itself to become officially, that's the marketing behind it, the chamber of the constitutive units. The new composition is pretty complicated, but there will no longer be directly elected senators. They will all be designated by parliaments of the communities. So at first, it sort of looks like the Bundesrat. But in fact, it will no longer be a permanent organ. It will just sit occasionally. Its powers will be very limited. There's only, and although there's a representation of the Walloon Parliament, it's again extremely bipolar. And to give just one example, I mentioned the emerging sense of regional identity in Brussels, which is far more complex than the dualism that Belgian institutions has incarnated. But in the Senate, again, the French Brusseliers can designate people and the Dutch can designate senators, but no senator can be multi-everything, although the population is increasingly multi. So current reform in Belgium and a federal unilateral initiative in Canada. So the federal government has tried to alter the part of the rules relative to the Senate, not by going through constitutional amendment, but by going through regular legislation. And it has asked the Supreme Court its opinion in a reference, which was heard last week, about what it can actually do. Can it change the term's mandate of the senators? For now, senators are nominated for life. It's a very cushy job. Now they would be, the federal government would like to limit the terms to between 7 and 10 years, something like that. Can they do that by legislation, not by amendment? Can they introduce provincial consultative process in the nomination? They cannot change the way senators are nominated without changing the Constitution. The Constitution provides that they're designated by the federal Prime Minister. But can the federal Prime Minister use the preferences of the provinces expressed through referendum and so on to do it? Can they do that without changing the Constitution? So these are the first two questions. The third one, what amending formula for abolition? The federal government concedes that it cannot abolish the Senate without modifying the Constitution. It cannot do it through legislation. It will concede that, but it says what is the formula applicable, because in the Canadian system there's different amending formulas for different types of changes to the Constitution. And basically the battle there is, do you need a majority of the population in 7 out of the 10 provinces, or do you need unanimity? The link with multinationalism here is A, the Aboriginal nations are nowhere to be seen, either in the current Senate or in a modified Senate or in the amending formula. The French minorities outside of Quebec have no say in that change either, because they are not consulted in the amending formula. Quebec, of course, would be included if the rule is unanimity. So that would be a protection for that French-speaking minority in Quebec. And for demographics, it would also be required to give its consent if if it was the other formula of 7 out of 10. But there's no provision for the French minority per se. And I will come to my conclusion. Federalism and subnationality and plurinationalism. I'm sorry. I think I just skipped one slide. I was going too fast. Two things I'd like to look at in terms of sort of causality, and that's always very difficult for lawyers to enter into. So please, political scientists and political philosophers, help me. Recognition through plurinationalism, through federalism. In Canada, has federalism done that? Well, originally, at least from one reading, the federal system was a recognition of the two nations or two people composing it. Institutions don't really recognize it except through territorial federalism, which provides a state apparatus to Quebec to be a majority on its territory. And so the minority becomes a majority. In Belgium, we can always wonder whether it ever was a nation state, but the subgroups didn't consider themselves to be nations earlier. So the system was designed to accommodate diversity. Not clear it was designed to accommodate national diversity. Has it created national diversity? And here I've just tried something, so help me. I'm turning the nation without state on its head a little bit. In Flanders, there was no sense of there was a sense of Flemish identity, but not of a Flemish nation per se. But then they got gradually the tools of statehood that federalism can provide: parliament, executive, competences, some resources, and so on. Sort of self-government in a way. And this has been used very effectively to construct a sense of national identity. So you go from no state and no nation to a state within the country leading to a nation. And then the question is, of course, whether Flanders will then become a nation state, whether it becomes independent and becomes sort of a more traditional nation state. Nothing of the sort has happened, and I've mentioned it several times, on the south of the country. Now in Canada, territorial federalism has transformed the French-Canadian nation, if it existed at the beginning, and I do believe it did, into a Quebec nation, to the exclusion of the other French-speaking minorities, which have become French-speaking minorities with minority language rights, but no role in the federal system per se. So the federal system has consolidated a new nation. And the question is, again, whether it would lead to a nation state. I think I will just stop here in interest of time. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, profesora Joan Poirier, por su ponencia. Tenemos ahora 10 minutos hasta la pausa. La pausa la tenemos que hacer forzosamente a las